Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Bon matin et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Every year, my office hosts an event to celebrate Data Privacy Day, which is observed around the world to raise awareness and promote privacy and data protection best practices. This marks my first Privacy Day as Ontario's Information and Privacy Commissioner. Cette journée de la protection des données revêt une importance toute particulière pour moi, car c'est ma première en tant que commissaire à l'information et à la protection de la vie privée de l'Ontario. Yesterday, we clocked in over 1,000 registrants for today's webinar across all sectors and, in fact, across the country, which is a true testament to the level of interest to today's topic, but also to the amazing IPC team who organized this event. So I want to thank you all, and you all know who you are. 7 months ago, I hit the ground running as a newly minted privacy commissioner, facing challenges and issues right off the bat requiring prompt attention. And one of those was the impact of police using technologies such as body-worn cameras. There's no question that law enforcement agencies are increasingly turning to this and other surveillance technologies to help them achieve greater public safety, gain operational efficiencies, capture critical evidence, and evaluate how police services are being delivered. This trend has significant implications for privacy and other rights that have become even more relevant, taking into consideration recent police-civilian encounters that have sadly resulted in tragedy. Public demands for police accountability and transparency are growing louder, as are related calls for new approaches to community policing and bias-free service delivery. A key question then is how law enforcement agencies can employ tools like body-worn cameras appropriately in a manner proportionate to their aims, with privacy and security protections embedded right into the technology and its deployment, guided by principles of transparency, accountability, and fairness. Une question clé est donc de savoir comment les corps policiers peuvent utiliser des nouvelles technologies de surveillance, telles que les caméras corporelles, de manière appropriée et proportionnelle, en protégeant la vie privée, tout en intégrant des principes de la transparence, de la reddition de comptes et de l'équité. Only with assurance that key guardrails are in place will the public come to trust the use of such technologies by law enforcement. Given the importance of the issues for Ontarians, my office has devoted substantial time and energy working with the Toronto Police Services Board and the Toronto Police Service on the development of a body-worn camera governance framework that hopefully will serve as a model for police operating across the province. And so, despite the considerable challenges, I come away from that positive experience confident that with the necessary governance framework in place, body-worn cameras can be implemented in a manner that protects the privacy rights of individuals while also addressing the need for transparency, access, accountability, as well as bias-free service delivery. Of course, when it comes to such complex, important, and evolving questions as law enforcement and surveillance technologies, the work is never done. So it's vital to acknowledge, first, that technologies raise privacy concerns often have significant implications for other rights as well. And it behooves privacy commissioners to work with others like human rights commissions and civil society groups to ensure our advice is supplemented by other voices and perspectives. The ethical use of technologies depends in part on the ability to deliver its intended societal benefits in a manner proportionate to its risks. Therefore, it's important to maintain a key eye on its ongoing effectiveness and to have mechanisms in place to pull the plug, so to speak, when a change in the risk-benefit calculus requires it. And finally, even a well-designed body-worn camera governance program can only provide a partial solution to the broader challenges and opportunities facing policing today, including the need to examine approaches and restore mutually beneficial and trusting relationship with the community. So all of this has inspired today's webcast, and I really hope you find today's Privacy Day panel to be informative and inspiring. I'm very excited about it, and I fully expect to learn so much more about the topic from our distinguished guests today. First, we're going to hear from Chris Parsons, Senior Research Associate at the Citizen Lab with the Mung School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Chris will give us an overview of emerging law enforcement-related surveillance technologies. We're then going to turn to a panel of experts from fields of law enforcement, academia, research, privacy, human rights, and media to hear their diverse insights and opinions on today's important topic of law enforcement and surveillance technologies. And after the panel, we're going to address questions from our audience and then move on to hear some key takeaways from my friend and colleague Ron Kruszynski, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Saskatchewan, and concluding remarks by my Assistant Commissioner, Ms. Sherry Liang. So let's begin. Chris, I'm handing the screen over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm just going to set my timer. So thank you, Commissioner, for the invitation to come and speak. And thank you to all of the IPC staff who have organized this and are ensuring it's running smoothly now and have set everything up ahead of time. And I look forward to hearing from our fellow panelists as well. So just by way of explanation, as the Commissioner has mentioned, my name is Chris Parsons. I'm from the Citizen Lab. The Citizen Lab is a human research laboratory. We operate at the intersection of human rights and technology. And we've been around for 20 years, but for about the last 10 or so, we've been doing a whole bunch of diverse things, which is part of why I'm here today. So let me just give you a background as to what we are and then jump right into it. So we do everything from threat intelligence, identifying how exactly different malware is designed, developed, and targeted at journalists and political dissidents and human rights defenders to try and understand who's responsible and then work with vendors to try and patch those kinds of vulnerabilities. One of our other teams is working with our international partners to constantly scan the internet to understand what exactly is censored and why and where. So why exactly is something blocked in Iran and what is the significance of that? We look at Chinese social media applications and really rip into them. We go into the code itself to understand how exactly is surveillance and censorship conducted within China, but increasingly, how exactly is it carried out beyond China's borders when individuals are installing Chinese social media applications in the West. We've done a little bit of work in disinformation and misinformation, with one of our highlight findings of late being that while there was a little bit in the last Canadian election, not that much, and certainly not compared to most other jurisdictions. And then finally, there's some of the work that I lead up quite a bit at the lab, which is our policy and legal work. So not a lawyer by training, although I sometimes pretend to be one on TV, it almost seems like. But we spend a lot of time looking at data protection, data privacy issues as it intersects with technology. So we both look at how governments are using technologies or are thinking about using technologies, how legislation could affect the adoption of technology, and then how private organizations are also adopting them. And often looking at the interexchange. So private companies developing something, it's accessible to the government, or vice versa. So in case you have to go away, your kid is called, or it's homework time, or the Zoom is down, or something like that, I just want to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to be talking about a bunch of new and emerging technologies that law enforcement agencies writ large are using. So I want to be very clear up front. It's not I'm not trying to say that every agency is using all of these, or they're using them in all the ways I'm going to talk about, but rather it's a canvassing of what is out there right now, or what will be there in the near future. But this is more than just talking about the technology. The biggest thing that I think is important to walk away with is, not necessarily the little bits and pieces about how technologies work, but the real need in the law enforcement community, but within government more broadly, to move away from a position of reflexive secrecy towards one of a reflexive accountability and transparency. As I'll point at the end of this talk, it's increasingly important that law enforcement agencies and others that are adopting new technologies explain what they're using, why they're using it, when they're using it, and the efficacy of which they're used in order for citizens to understand and appreciate the value, or frankly, in some cases, the lack thereof of those technologies. Citizens must be able to identify what legitimizes and authorizes the use of these technologies, both so they can be used lawfully and also so citizens can be brought into a public debate at the onset, as opposed to 5 or 10 years after a technology may have been deployed. But let's zoom out a little bit. What is the structure of what I'm going to be talking to you? As you can tell, I'm talking from notes. So if I look down periodically, that's what I'm looking at. So first, I think it's important to think of where we are today. What exactly is going on now, and why are we living in sort of a sci-fi, either utopia or dystopia, depending on the science fiction author of your choice. Then I'm going to go through a series of technologies, including body-worn cameras and others. And I'm going to conclude with an argument that technologies are all political. And as such, we have to treat them as such, and with the delicateness of political affairs. So where are we right now today? So if we think about, I don't know, let's say law enforcement 30 or 40 years ago, you know, if you kept a diary, it was probably beside your bed or at a desk or something like that. If you had business records, they're probably in some degree of organization in a filing cabinet. If you were using the cutting edge version of Instagram at the time, you're probably using Polaroids, and you had snapshots sitting in a desk or in a photo album or something of that nature. If you were out and about town, tracking you actually often meant tracking you. That, you know, there was a PI or there was a law enforcement officer or a team of law enforcement officers that would have had to monitor where you're going, doing you know, a variety of modes of tradecraft, so you weren't necessarily, you didn't realize you're being tracked, but it was a resource intensive process. And there was lots of things that were just, you know, pretty hard to figure out unless you had cameras in someone's home or place of business. You didn't know when they walked down a hallway. You didn't know when they were sitting or talking with someone else in the office or in the home. Well, what about figuring out who was in an event? Well, quite often that was, you know, building up an informant or a network of people who could tell you who's going to be at an event. Maybe it was taking photos and then using those photos to prompt people who knew who were at various events, or maybe it was going through mugshot books, like, oh, does this look like this person? Does it look like that person? And how do we do things like, you know, predicting where officers should be deployed? Obviously, statistics were being used 30 or 40 years ago to try and predict trends in crime and understand where officers should be deployed. But frankly, it was a fairly crude affair compared to what's possible today. And of course, today, all of this is different. How much of our information that was once private is now ostensibly placed in the public, though for private purposes? Our snapshots are now Instagram. Our diaries are now blogs, for those that still have them. Our business records, and our personal records for that matter, are almost entirely kept out of our homes, set on servers either in Canada, the United States, or, you know, wherever it happens to be this moment before it gets shared or traded to another server somewhere else in the world. Our location is both explicitly monitored when we open our mapping application and implicitly or quietly monitored when we just carry our cell phones around, or in the background when our applications notify app developers that indeed it is my time to pray. And then when it comes to figuring out who's at a protest, the number of ways we can do that are transformative. We have facial recognition technologies that can either try and pick out specific individuals, are they there? Or more broadly, who are all the people there, depending on the technology that's adopted. And of course, we can't forget that predictive policing technologies, such as those that are being adopted in Vancouver, are enabling law enforcement officers and agencies to better understand and deploy forces where they think that there will be the next outbreak of crime. All of this is to say, the technologies and the reality in which we live today is mind-numbingly different than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And this isn't a call back to them per se, but rather I think it's important to start any discussion of new technologies with a recognition of how different our world is now, so that we can prompt ourselves to ask, is all of the technology that we're adding a gain, or are there some things that were helpful in the inefficiencies of the past? And I don't have a strong answer for that in this talk, but it's just something to keep in mind throughout. So technologies are almost inherently political. So let's touch on the first that the commissioner noted at the front, body-worn cameras. Body-worn cameras are routinely called for when a community or a set of communities think that they have been inappropriately interacted by the police, so someone is shot, some instance of violence, or some act of inappropriate behavior is perceived. Alternately, in some cases, you also see officers say, well, it would be lovely if we had these cameras because that way we'd be able to prove that, you know, whatever we're being accused of doing, in fact, didn't happen. So they act, in theory, as an accountability tool in two directions. Police services accountable to the public in a more transparent way, and vice versa. But the manner and means by which these cameras operate can reconfigure the way that power operates in these situations. And so let's touch on a few ways that that happens through the way that technology operates, as well as some of the challenges that sometimes arise with cameras, which I suspect we'll talk more about on the panel, so I won't belabor the points. So as many of us are probably very well aware, these cameras, you clip them onto an officer's vest or sometimes attached to glasses, and they're capable of collecting, obviously, video information, sometimes audio information, sometimes GPS information. Sometimes you can attach metadata into the clip that's been recorded, either in real time or an officer may do it after an incident or after a shift or something of that nature. And the means by which data is collected also varies quite considerably. So in some cases, these devices will be constantly collecting data. They're just on by default, and then they're turned off at officer discretion or based on an officer implementing policies that have been set up by their agency. In other cases, when an event has taken place, then they choose to tap it on. So they have an interaction with the public or something of that nature. In other instances, we see that the way that these cameras are activated actually doesn't have anything to do with the officer per se, but rather it's the behaviors that they're involved in. So let's say the audio sensor on these cameras picks up heightened noises or shouting or yelling or something like that. Boom, they can snap on. Or as soon as an officer draws their firearm, boom, the camera goes on. Or as soon as a lot of motion is detected, perhaps the officer is running, boom, the camera's on. And of course, there are dash cameras that as soon as a siren is activated or the lights are spun up, again, the camera can initiate. But in all of these situations, we can see that there is a number of power relationships that are built in, either because there's a discretion that's afforded to the officer to understand the policy, because the way the camera itself is built may be better or worse in low light or non-light. It may catch some things that are taking place and not others. All of us have smartphone cameras, and all of us have realized at this point when we're in a party, we can still go to them, of course, that one person's capturing an event and another person's capturing an event at a different angle at a different time with a different camera can be totally different. And so as we see these cameras deployed more and more commonly, there is a question of what are they capturing? Who are they designed for? How representative of events are they? And then even broader questions of how useful are they? How useful are they in the stated policy goals, either of improving transparency, of combating racism, of decreasing violent encounters between the public and the police? These are all different metrics, and they're all increasingly under study, but with very few definitive, aha, this works, or oh no, it doesn't. But nonetheless, we're adopting these in our society. So what are some of the issues? Of course, there's the concern of mass surveillance or broadened surveillance of the public. So at protests or just when they're going about their regular days, and modifying their behaviors because they believe that they may be recorded. Separately, these cameras can be deeply invasive in private situations where law enforcement officers, as an example, are responding to certain criminal situations or issues or disputes, domestic abuse, sexual assault, situations where children may be involved. There's, of course, issues around what data is retained, for how long, and who has access to it. Is it the case that records are deleted after a short period of time? Are they kept indefinitely? Can data be used subsequently to train artificial intelligence technologies? These are all pressing questions the public is routinely concerned about. Under what conditions are records that are captured by body-worn cameras disclosed? Are they disclosed automatically to opposing counsel who may be bringing charge against an officer? Are they shown to an officer themselves before or after, if ever, when they're writing up a log on an incident they were involved in? Or is the disclosure largely left to the discretion of a police chief or a police board? All of these questions are important and configure the way that power can be expressed and realized through the use of these cameras. And to be clear, this isn't an argument for or against them per se, but rather to identify that this isn't a neutral technology. It's a politically and power-laden technology. And so the governance frameworks that are developed are of course essential, as are the demonstration that they have been implemented and they can be reconfigured if and as needed. But I just mentioned a technology a second ago. Artificial intelligence and facial recognition technologies are part of an AI system. But what is AI? To be frank, it's getting to the point where everything is AI, and so it's starting to be like nothing is artificial intelligence. But AI is, as many of us probably are well aware, is laden with biases, and it's the underpinning of a lot of the next generation technologies and the ways of using data that are currently collected in a more or less discrete fashion, such as, in some places, footage from body-worn cameras. It's not necessarily tied to AI now, but the concern, of course, is it could be in the future. So what is AI? And what are the problems with it? Well, to give you an example of how political AI is, first, what are you building an algorithm for? Is it an entire community has come together and said, oh yes, we definitely need a new technology and it should be powered by AI? Or is it a certain subset of stakeholders in a broader community like, this would be helpful, it would improve efficiency, it would cut down on things that we identify as problems, but that may or may not be identified as problems, or the underlying things to solve within the community writ large. So problem definition, politics and power number one. Then we get into a situation with the people who are actually building the algorithm. So when people are building anything in society, they come at a certain time, a certain place, a certain mindset, a certain set of biases. And to be clear, biases are how we navigate the world. Our brain is built to discriminate. It's how we can walk around the world and not be overwhelmed by all the sense data that we come into contact with. But nonetheless, especially in a policing context, those biases are problematic and significant. So to what extent are the developers biased? And frankly, if the developers or the users of a technology ever think that there aren't politics involved in whatever they're building or using, let me assure you, it's just that your politics happen to be so elided with whatever that technology is that we're not mindful of the technology. Even a crockpot has a technology, if you do the research as I've learned. Fascinating, a little bit on the side, but let me assure you that every technology is political. The design of every technology is political. So now we have the problem of AI is trying to solve is political. We have potentially bias into the algorithm. And then we have what most people are most familiar with these days, the bias in the training data itself. So we know is one example of GPT-3, which is a huge AI system that's going through and drawing correlations in text. It was recently came out in the past week or two that after feeding it petabytes of data, so huge amounts of text, it turns out that we have turned the AI into drawing correlations between Muslims, individuals or people identifying as of the Muslim faith, and violence. And this is a known fact. And rather than saying, okay, should we deploy this technology? This seems to be a pretty substantive problem. Now there are, well, it's so powerful and we've spent a lot of money into it, can we just make modifications so it's less biased? This is just to point out that even the best trained scientists who are doing everything they can to mitigate bias are not necessarily able to do it. And this is a situation where those individuals were carefully and painstakingly looking for bias, which let me assure you is rarely the case and a huge portion of the artificial intelligence technologies that are deployed. But the other issue with AI, or rather the other two issues with artificial intelligence writ large are, first, AI lies because we tell it to lie. Let me explain what I mean by that, because that seems a little bit weird. Why are our machines telling us false things? Well, they're doing it because when we look at training, when we look at an AI, we give it a huge volume of data. And on the one hand, it might be asked, figure out the correlations. We don't know what they are, but you figure them out. And it might come to a certain correlation and you're like, no, that's not accurate. That doesn't make any sense. In other situations, we may be giving it data and we may say, we know what the answer is, and we want you to figure out what the answer happens to be. And so in that latter case, we may understand that A plus B equals C. But when the AI algorithm parses through it, it says, oh no, A plus B equals 9. And of course, the people who are training the algorithm, like, no, you've made a mistake. So we keep correcting it back to A plus B equals C, A plus B equals C. And eventually the system is designed, of course, A plus B equals C. The problem, however, is A plus B actually does equal 9. And what we've done, instead of teaching it the correct answer, the AI may have revealed a fundamental flaw or bias in our own understanding. So AI can lie, and that's something that is very difficult to detect once it's there, especially when the lies align with our own underlying biases. And then we only know when AI isn't working, usually when individuals are able to get right into the code, when they're able to look at the training data, when they're able to study how the algorithm was initially set up and run experiment after experiment after experiment to see if they can get to the result that is promised and then ascertain what the problems are underneath it. But in a contemporary context where it's pretty rare the government is building these systems, and instead they're often purchased from private companies, often with riders attached to them saying, you're not allowed to share core technical information, or we won't share core technical information with the government. That means that not only is the government challenged in their ability to assure the public and themselves, frankly, that there's no bias, but when it comes time to a criminal justice system, we also can't figure out if the technology is biased or not. And as anyone who has had the pleasure or lack thereof of dealing with the criminal justice system, you'll know that lawyers are not the most technically advanced people on the whole to begin with, which creates a further problem where technologies are allowed to be used and reused and reused, often in the criminal justice system, without receiving the dedicated and absolutely necessary probing and assessment of what their biases are, how they work, and more importantly, how they may not work. But how is AI used? Well, I'm just going to touch on two cases, two examples. It's used in facial recognition technologies, and it's used in some predictive policing technologies. So with regards to the former, facial recognition technology, we see artificial intelligence almost on a daily basis, depending on the devices in your home, used to identify you to log into your devices. It's used when you take a photo quite often to figure out faces, face detection, or it's used to identify that that face belongs to someone you know, facial recognition technologies. And the way it's designed vary considerably. In some cases, facial recognition technologies are involve the collection of huge volumes of information, often non-consensually, and then it will run every face that's presented to it against the universe of faces that's collected, with the most evident example in recent history being Clearview AI, a system that was developed by non-consensually accessing all of the faces that they could find on Facebook and other social media applications, developing algorithms, and then quietly and often secretly provided to law enforcement agencies and other groups to then assess what faces are in what crowds or in other photography or video taken by law enforcement. But we know that facial recognition technologies are deeply biased. To give you an example, if you look at a lot of the most commonly used facial recognition technologies in North America, or that are developed by North American developers, they're very good quite often at identifying Caucasian faces and increasingly faces of Asian ethnicity. But they're not particularly good at identifying the faces of Black individuals. In contrast, if you hop over to Japan, you'll find that their ability to differentiate between Japanese faces and faces of people of Asian ethnicity broadly is far better than what you tend to see in North America. In contrast, their ability to parse Caucasian faces is not nearly as advanced as what we see in North America. What does that mean? It means that you have a higher likelihood of mismatches. So let's say you run a facial recognition technology over a group of protesters. As far as I know, there's not a case in Canada, to say nothing perhaps of the US, where a facial recognition technology picks someone's name and then the police automatically arrest whoever that person is. In every situation I know of, including in the Toronto Police Service, any instance where facial recognition is used, there's an officer there to confirm the accuracy, because it's important to have a human in the middle of the machines. But you can nonetheless get bias. So when we know this from any number of court cases and legal situations where an officer will make a mistaken identity or identification between a photo and a face. And the worry with facial recognition technologies is it can prompt that. It can say, hey, doesn't that photo look like Chris? And maybe all of a sudden the officer is like, oh, well, I guess it sort of does. And then an investigation is launched into me. How else can AI be used? Well, it can be used to send officers to areas where crime is expected to rise. So in the case of Vancouver, it's used for certain kinds of crimes. And positively, the Vancouver Police Department has identified that there's certain areas that simply can't have officers respond to. The downtown east side is excluded from all of the crime statistics on the basis they recognize it would bias the AI. And they periodically check to see if there are biases in the way officers are being deployed. But nonetheless, we can see in a department that has not spent the same amount of time and resources and is using the tool to predict not just break-ins, but more violent offenses, there's a possibility of allocating police to parts of cities or communities that are already identified as over-policed. What are some of the other technologies that I'll just touch on in brief that are substantive? There's the use of malware by law enforcement to intrude into devices, a practice that occurs in Canada today and of course across North America, but is understudied and underappreciated. There's very little accountability publicly for how often it's used, the rationales, or the efficacy of it. We know that there's the use of IMSI catchers or devices that collect mobile identifiers over the air. It took about 10 years of pushing in this country, including through the IPC, to understand how law enforcement groups in Ontario were using it. And at the federal level, it took an equivalent amount of time to figure out how the federal government was using technology. Now, currently in Canada, the asserted use of these technologies is just to collect identifiers, and also in some cases to engage in localized geolocation. But we know by looking at China and India and other places around the world that you can also access content and indeed inject content to the effect of potentially serving malware to intrude upon devices. And of course, we can't forget the different kinds of applications that are being developed right now to monitor chat rooms and other technologies and collect data on the basis that law enforcement has a believed need to investigate it. The concern being, we don't necessarily know how often these are used. And sometimes, as in the case of IMSI catchers in some cases, chat monitoring systems in other cases, malware in yet others, we see inappropriate legal safeguards being built into the technologies and insufficient warrant powers obtained to use them. So my concluding seconds, I just want to focus on one thing. Technology is inherently political. There is power built into how technology is applied across our communities. And this is especially true with surveillance technologies, which by definition express power over other parties. Law enforcement is given an incredibly delicate and challenging job. And key to doing their job is ensuring the public can have trust and faith in what they're doing. Now, we've seen quite often over the past decade or two, law enforcement agencies across North America say, we can't disclose what we're doing because if we disclose it, the bad guys will understand and be able to evade what we're doing. That's possible. But that's the cost of living in a democracy. We know that production orders exist, and we know information can be obtained from servers. We know wiretaps exist. We now know IMSI catchers exist. Making public how these technologies operate, not necessarily at the, we use version X and here are the problems with it, but at a high level, what data they collect, when they're operated, the rules around them, how frequently they're used, how useful are they in securing both arrests and convictions. These are the kinds of information that are required in order to assess the utility of these tools and in order for citizens to understand how law is being exercised on their behalf by law enforcement. When we move into situations where citizens are unable to see the link between the laws that they have democratically legitimized through their elected representatives and the laws they are applied, we risk further delegitimizing our institutions. And I think as everyone knows, just looking south the past several weeks, we are at a crisis point of institutions and people understanding, respecting, and seeing our institutions as legitimate. I'm not saying Canada is the United States, but I am saying that even our institutions are increasingly under threat. They're under huge pressures to demonstrate their legitimacy. And just one way is adopting reflexive accountability and transparency to repair institutions and ensure that they are able to not just last through the next 5 years or 10 years, but the next 30 years when we have this conversation. We're talking about brain scans and the way that walking near your Wi-Fi access point dictates your emotional state or how hungry or not you happen to be. Thank you very much. I look forward to the panel.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that amazing overview of surveillance technologies increasingly being used by and considered by police services. What an excellent job you did, and I can't imagine anybody else being able to explain it so well and succinctly as you did. Incredibly complex, but you did an amazing job setting the stage for the panel this morning. And on that note, I want to turn to the panel discussion, and I'd like to, for the purposes of the panel discussion, I'd like to zero in on body-worn cameras, if I may, as a bit of a case study. So let's turn to our panelists, and I want to introduce them. We have Dhir, Executive Director and Chief Legal Officer of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. We have Colin, a reporter from the Globe and Mail. Steve McCammon, who is legal counsel at my office at the IPC. Alana Saulnier, criminology coordinator and professor at Lakehead University. And we have Colin, Chief Information Officer with the Toronto Police Service. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining our panel today. So on that, let's begin. First question over to you, Stephen. This being Data Privacy Day, let me start with you, given your role as legal counsel at the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. I'd like to ask you to describe the work that we've done with the Toronto Police, and particularly that you spearheaded on behalf of our office, and speak to us about the privacy and security implications of police use of body-worn cameras.
Thanks very much, Commissioner, and really enjoyed Chris's remarks as well, and very pleased to be here. Regret we're not in person with everybody, but really grateful to have a chance to engage in this important discussion this morning. Just quickly before diving into the meat of the privacy issues, I thought it's important to put forward the following. My own experience from 15 plus years at the IPC and 10 years prior to that at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association convinces me that public safety is a public good, and that police have key but changing roles in achieving public safety. And I also know that the past isn't past, or it's not gone, it's not even past. We do have centuries of challenges to face in terms of history of discrimination and colonization, and those histories affect the posture and position of every organization, community, and individual. The promise of the era we live in is that more and more of us are working together to address these painful parts of our inheritance. And with that, I'll turn to the work the IPC has done with the service and the board that on body-worn cameras. That goes back to 2014 and Toronto's body-worn camera pilot project. It took on additional urgency 8 months ago with the death of Regis Korchinski-Paquette. But in the weeks that followed, more and more hours were put in hammering out the details of a governance framework capable of enhancing transparency and accountability while protecting the public's vital expectation of privacy. To everyone's credit, that work hasn't really let up. Even last week, the procedure was being finalized, and throughout this work, the IPC has had the benefit of the federal, provincial, territorial body-worn guidance issued in 2015, as well as the benefit of several critical meetings with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The result is a board policy and a service procedure that provide a foundation for the police use of body-worn cameras across the province. Of course, aspects of this work will continue, including in the context of the Commissioner's commitment to issue body-worn camera guidance later this year. And we've committed to this work for two interconnected reasons. First, the privacy impact is substantial. Whether you're at a protest or in a hospital, whether you're a person in crisis or a person of interest, witness, a suspect, a victim, or a complainant, when police body-worn cameras are rolling, they capture large volumes of very sensitive personal information. And that personal information must be secured and protected, and its use carefully controlled through rules and systems capable of ensuring a number of things. I'll refer to four. First, that body-worn cameras are used in a fully transparent, consistent, and open fashion, including by the use of audio-visual control clues on an officer's chest. Body-worn camera footage and related metadata must be stored and transmitted securely, and access to body-worn camera footage must be authorized and appropriate, as supported by logging, auditing, and public reporting requirements. And fourthly, that oversight and accountability are in place to evaluate, restrict, and control the use of other related surveillance technologies like facial recognition. And the second motivator for continuing this work is, given the substantial privacy impact, it is essential that body-worn camera programs pay a high dividend in terms of both protecting human rights and dignity and enhancing transparency and accountability. While body-worn cameras look out at members of the public is watching too, and public trust in policing requires an ongoing commitment to delivering those dividends. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Stephen. Professor Saulnier, I'd like to turn to you next. One of the questions the public may have is how effective body-worn cameras are in enhancing public safety, reducing unnecessary use of force, and strengthening transparency and accountability of police. As one of the key researchers in the country who's studying the effectiveness of body-worn cameras, what are you finding in this regard?
It's a really good question. And because the way that we accumulate an evidence base is by understanding a body of research, I'll comment on the broader knowledge base in this area rather than just my work. There's actually a good amount of research exploring outcomes associated with police use of body-worn cameras, but the findings across that body of work are often inconsistent, and mixed results make answering the question challenging. But what I'll do is comment on a few things, and I'll start with a finding that has been very consistent, and that's that the general public is very supportive of police adopting BWCs. That's a fact from dozens of studies. Given that the public has this expectation, police adopting BWCs may communicate to the public that public expectations are valued by police, which theoretically would have a positive effect on community police relations. So there we see some empirical evidence that connects to a theoretical explanation of how public perceptions of police accountability may be impacted by the adoption of BWCs. Sticking in the realm of public perceptions, I conducted research here in Ontario that demonstrated that people who interacted with officers wearing BWCs felt more positively about those interactions than people who interacted with officers not wearing BWCs. And that finding is complementary to several other international studies. So there we've got some consistent findings about BWCs having a positive effect on public perceptions of police. And perceptions of police accountability are important, but they are distinct from other measures of police accountability, for example, complaints or use of force and resolutions of both of these things, which also speak to public safety. The effect of BWCs on police use of force is a great example of an outcome that we do not have a clear understanding of. Some studies find that BWCs decrease use of force, others find that BWCs have no effect on use of force, and still others have found that BWCs increase use of force. So why is this the case? A very recent review of use of force studies found that the BWC policy may be important here. It seems that limiting officer discretion around camera activation may help decrease use of force incidents. Moving to complaints, we see a more consistent set of results, and that's that BWC use seems to reduce complaints. But the reason for why is up in the air. One explanation is that the quality of police-public interactions improves because the BWC affects officer and/or citizen behavior. Another explanation is that BWC use is impacting reporting behavior. For instance, that frivolous complaints are less likely to be made. So the explanation for the outcome is unclear, but the outcome is nonetheless desirable. In a close-to-home example, in Toronto, civil litigation against the Toronto Police Services Board costs an average of $9.3 million a year. And during that service's BWC pilot, they had 23 complaints that were made against officers in the pilot, and in all 23 cases, the officers were cleared of the complaint. That outcome suggests that BWCs have value connected to accountability. Providing timely resolutions to complaints, particularly those in which police were deemed to be acting appropriately, may enhance community police relations. Summing up, measuring these effects in the real world is challenging, but there are promising indicators of the value of BWCs for police in service to their communities when that technology is used in conjunction with thoughtful and enforced policy, as well as increasingly reformed police culture that includes more frontline supervision.
Thank you, Alana. Colin Stairs, you're Chief Information Officer for the Toronto Police Service. That's probably the furthest along in the province in terms of their body-worn camera adoption plans. So let me ask you, from your perspective, or from the perspective of the police, what are some of the benefits or concerns of using body-worn cameras? And how likely are police services and police officers to embrace this new technology?
Joe, let me start by saying that I agree wholeheartedly with Chris and Alana. On Chris's point that these are political, and they're, depending on how you define the policies and procedures around body-worn cameras, there is a very significant impact on power and the power relationship and dynamic. And I think what Alana's pointing out is that these things can have a positive impact if the policy procedure are well thought through. So we are encountering many of the challenges that Chris is talking about and many of the trade-offs. And so the critical conversations that we're having have to be around what is the saw-off, what is the policy that the public wants us to have around these technologies. And having those thought through in a public space gives legitimacy to a program. So I think that's super important to stress. The on-the-ground reality with our officers is that they were reticent at first, that this was another accountability measure, more oversight, more negativity directed towards police. But what they're finding in practice is that this is an additional record, more complete and dispassionate, and that's actually aiding them in their work, and it's having a civilizing impact on interactions with police. Now, Alana kind of pointed to some of the reasons why that might be, but certainly the reduction in complaints against police, the police perspective on that is that that there are fewer frivolous complaints. So this is having a positive impact, but I think if those on the call are interested, we've made this procedure and the policy public, and so they have the ability to review that and see where we've come to that conclusion, where the balance has been drawn. And I think the IPC has been central in both providing a place to have this conversation and in helping move this conversation through. Thank you.
Let me turn to the other Colin with us today, Colin Fries, a reporter with the Globe and Mail. So Colin, given some of the very high profile deaths and injuries that have unfortunately occurred in Canada and in the US over the past year, how important is it for journalists such as yourself to gain access to footage caught by body-worn cameras in order to provide the public with additional context of what may have transpired or happened?
Yeah, I think for journalists broadly, this is a potentially deep new pool of footage that we'll be seeking to acquire through the means available to us to round out our reporting stories. I mean, a few adages come to mind. if you build it, we will come. I mean, if there is a pool of footage that relay police and public interactions in great detail and incontrovertible ways, of course, journalists who are nothing more than the interlocutors of the public will be seeking that in cases where conflicts erupt. The other thing is seeing is believing. I think that the video has a immediacy and a power to sort of, lay bare the sort of frictions that can result in police use of force cases, obviously. Now, we don't have a lot of, obviously the George Floyd death and the Black Lives Matters protests in the United States and Canada over the past years have sort of put these issues top of mind. And so have some Canadian cases. I'm thinking of cases like the Alan Adams interaction with the RCMP in Fort McMurray, where, there was dash cam video of him getting, tackled as he was arrested. I mean, that sort of reversed, I think, a set of charges against him and put the sort of police of jurisdiction on their back foot to explain why they used excessive force. And also in the case that was already mentioned, the tragic case of the woman who fell from the balcony in Hyde Park after a police call, that initially sort of came out as an allegation that police interaction had led to her death. The Provincial Special Investigations Unit came out many weeks later with a report saying, no, that was not true. And that report incidentally relied on microphone police officers, Toronto Community Housing video, dashcam video, and sort of, it was a correction of the sort of public record that people sort of waited for a long time. So I think, as this footage exists, body-worn camera footage exists, will be of enormous value to journalists and journalism. The challenge on the people in my profession will be to navigate these sort of gatekeepers, the police chiefs, the SIU commissioners, the courts, who really are the people who are going to be able to sort of access this video. Journalists will have no direct access to this maybe through Freedom of Information requests. I don't know, but we'll have to see how that works as we go on.
Wonderful, thank you. So as we've heard, body-worn cameras raise important issues of privacy, transparency, and accountability, but that's not all. There are broader human rights issues at play. And Raj Dhir, who is the Executive Director of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, I'd like to ask you, what are some of those broader human rights issues we should be mindful of? So, for example, are there potentially disproportionate impacts of body-worn cameras on racialized communities? Or can their use at public protests, for example, result in a potentially chilling effect on people's freedom of expression? Raj, over to you.
Hey, thank you. So further to Chris and Professor Saulnier's comments, when you're introducing body-worn cameras into a system, it's important to recognize that we're not doing this in a clinical environment where we can control for social and environmental factors. We need to be aware of the context. Policies and procedures which can appear neutral on their face may have disproportionate impacts on certain communities. In the Toronto Police consultation on body-worn cameras, one of the concerns that the Ontario Human Rights Commission raised was the policy which permits body-worn cameras to be used in conjunction with Toronto Police mugshot database. Given our findings of overcharging by the Toronto Police and its disproportionate impacts on Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities, we were concerned that this will exacerbate existing racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Now, it's critical to understand that the Toronto Police Service has a massive mugshot database. As of May 2019, the Toronto Star reported that this database contained 1.5 million mugshots. And also, as noted in the 2020 report by the Citizens Lab to Surveil and Predict, mugshot databases can contain photos of individuals who have never been charged with a criminal offense, who have had their charges withdrawn, or who have been found innocent of allegations. In Ontario, only 29% of criminal charges result in a finding of guilt. And as the Ontario Human Rights Commission reported in a disparate impact, that number drops down to about 20% in Toronto. So far from being exclusively populated with images of convicted criminals, mugshot databases include individuals who haven't been found guilty of anything. And a disproportionate number of those individuals are Indigenous, Black, and racialized. So taken together, these considerations explain why the Citizen Lab report makes the following observation. It says, facial recognition programs may expose charter-protected groups to disproportionate levels of suspicion and police scrutiny compared to individuals who have not been captured in mugshot databases. For these reasons, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has called on the Toronto Police to prohibit using body-worn camera data in conjunction with mugshots, consistent with what we've seen in other jurisdictions, such as the Baltimore Police Department. Now, with respect to public protests, the Toronto Police's policy allows the use of body-worn camera recordings in combination with the mugshot database if there are reasonable grounds to believe that an offense has been committed in the protest. The problem, as the Citizen Lab report notes, is that historically participants in these mass demonstrations have been able to rely on their relative anonymity in the crowd to enable their exercise of those rights and to keep their identity private from employers, law enforcement, and other authorities. So when you're using facial recognition and other similar capabilities that are actually exposing these individuals, that they're actually impeding the fundamental ability to exercise some of those freedoms. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Raj. So as an office, the IPC has taken the position that with the right governance framework in place, body-worn cameras could help enhance public safety, transparency, and accountability of police, while also ensuring the privacy and security of individuals. So suppose we were being asked to design an effective governance framework for the use of body-worn cameras by police, right here, right now. What are the two elements you would each like to see in that governance framework? Alana, let me start with you.
I think that something that's critical to BWC policy is activation expectations, and that activation and deactivation be as clear and simple as possible with limited opportunity for discretion. Many international BWC policy guidelines advocate for activation policies that diminish officer discretion, and research supports that direction, with the outcomes desired of BWCs, such as complaint reduction, being greater when BWC activation is more consistent. I think that there absolutely needs to be latitude in policies to provide officers with the opportunity to give a reasonable explanation for the failure to activate a BWC or the decision to deactivate a BWC, but that ideally we want BWC activation to be common and consistent. Second, for me, demonstrating care for the communities that police serve is incredibly important to a sound policy. One example is providing notification as soon as reasonably possible during interactions with the public when the BWC is activated. Apart from being necessary to achieve a purported subject civilizing effect, notification also demonstrates sensitivity to privacy concerns. BWCs have the potential to infringe on reasonable expectations of privacy. Mandating notification reconciles concerns that BWCs will be used for covert recordings. And before I turn it over, I'll also say that there are other ways that a BWC policy can demonstrate care for the public, one of which is including victim-sensitive practices, but we're still in the process of developing an evidence base in that regard. I'm conducting research on that topic, and if you go to my Twitter page, you'll see an ad there recruiting survivors of sexual assault and/or intimate partner violence to share their thoughts on police use of BWCs. If you're listening to this and you're a survivor, or you can share this with survivors, your help is very appreciated.
Thank you. Stephen, what would be your two key elements in a governance framework? Stephen, we can't hear you.
Isn't that the word of the year? You're on mute, or the phrase of the year?
That's right.
Sorry about that. So the two must-haves for the governance framework that I'm going to focus on relate to public access to body-worn camera footage and the companion requirement that access respect personal privacy. So let me set those two in context. One of the fundamental principles of justice is that justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. Police officers, of course, play a critical role in our system of justice, and their decisions and conduct shape public confidence in that system. It follows, I think, that the public must have timely access to critical information about law enforcement decisions and activities, and not just those that end up before a judge, jury, or a tribunal. And that's why it's been so important in the work we've done with the Toronto Police Service and its board to advance the work of recognizing and defining the discretion police have to proactively disclose body-worn camera footage to address the public's growing interest in understanding how, for example, police make decisions about the supervision, training, and discipline of officers when it comes to the use of force. Of course, in disclosing body-worn camera footage related to the police use of force, the police must take steps to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals caught on camera. That's where rules come in to ensure that police make appropriate use of tools to blur the faces and voices of members of the public before making a disclosure. And finally, let me sneak in a third related must-have, which is the requirement that police provide written reasons for refusing to make a public interest disclosure.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Colin Stairs, what are your two must-haves?
I think the first one is clarity for the officers. We are sitting here on a panel with plenty of time to think about these issues ahead of time. Oftentimes, officers will be in situations that are quickly evolving and maybe changing in their nature. They need clarity to understand when the camera should be on, when the camera should be off. When are they protecting the privacy interests that Stephen is describing of the individual, and when are they having the camera on for the accountability reasons? I think we've done a really good job on that in the procedure, and it speaks to Alana's comment on making sure that that clarity is there and that the camera's on as much as it can be, or as it should be. So I would say that's the one thing that the officers really need to be able to follow. The second is thinking about the body-worn camera as part of an overarching and proportional accountability system. So if we think about the separation of oversight, we think about how the reviews are taking place, and we're thinking about when those reviews are taking place. Also, how are we bringing guidance back to individual officers that isn't in a disproportional or punitive way, but is guiding them towards better and improved behaviors? I think those are important aspects of this. We have to remember that the headline catching events are once in a career kind of events for officers. The events that are happening on a day-to-day basis are having continuous low grade, but they're having impact. And so we need to use this overarching proportional accountability system to guide them as opposed to punish them.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. Chris, what about you? What would be your top two?
So the first is a little bit different from some of the others, but I think it's actually, we need to seriously reflect with the stakeholder communities who are most affected by policing, what needs to be solved. And so Raj mentioned the Citizen Lab report that my colleagues Cynthia Koo and Kate Robertson put out. We looked at artificial intelligence technologies, including FRT. The thing that came out in doing outreach with community stakeholders was real questions of, is this needed? Our underlying problems are more substantive, and will cameras move towards solving that? So I think first, it's actually making sure that the governance framework is responsive to the governance issues. I think we've noted many of them, but I think it's important to have those who are most disproportionately affected at the front and center of ensuring that the governance framework is actually appropriate. And so they're the people that will know what needs to be there. So they need to be very involved in the critique and ongoing evaluation of it. tied to that is I think that we need to have clear metrics for whether these tools are working or not. So, Alana mentioned a number of conditions. Does it work here? Does it work there? What's the research say? That's exactly the sort of thing that we need to be doing. We have to have research, but then clearly identify what the purposes of these are for. Often the public regards these as, I want to stop police shooting people inappropriately. Makes lots of sense. Officers want to say, well, we want frivolous complaints to drop off and save us all time, money, stress, and effort. There's other purposes, which is to use these as training tools. And when officers have body-worn cameras on, can we engage a more effective campaign or process to sensitize issues to systemic racism issues and diminish it in the force? So these are all, I think, important, credible, valuable things to be aiming for, but it means that we have to know what we're looking for. So we don't get into a situation where we develop a technology to do A, and then over time say, oh, well, maybe we could use it for these other things too, when we haven't actually architected the governance framework or the tool even to facilitate that. So I think it's just really important to think, what is the actual goal that we're trying to solve? And then make sure that the framework that's put in place enables the data collection, the data analysis, the data security, and the data privacy to ensure we can hit what those goals happen to be.
Excellent. So definitely making those, building those fundamental pillars on which the governance framework has to essentially rest. Excellent points. Raj, from your perspective, what two things would you like to see in a governance framework?
In the Toronto Police consultation on body-worn cameras, the Ontario Human Rights Commission raised a number of points related to governance. One of the challenges of being one of the last speakers on this point is that my colleagues have all made excellent points that overlap with some of the points I intended to make, but I'm going to share my points from our perspective, from a human rights perspective. And the first point that I want to talk about is something that's actually recognized in the Toronto Police policy, and that is that an effective framework should allow individuals who file police misconduct complaints to view all relevant footage in an accessible and expedient manner. Now, if we look out west, where all frontline officers have body-worn cameras, we've seen troubling instances where complainants have been denied access to footage. In October 2019, for example, a 51-year-old woman was arrested by Calgary officers in her own home. Among other things, she was on the floor with an officer on top of her while she repeatedly cried out, "I can't breathe." How do we know that? Because her son filmed her arrest with his cell phone. So what about the body-worn camera footage? As two police researchers have noted, no body-worn camera footage has been released in this case, and the police service has no plans to release the video, publicly citing policy, legal, and privacy reasons. Even more concerning, Calgary police have not released the body-worn camera footage to the woman or her lawyer despite repeated requests to do so. Needless to say, if we want body-worn camera to achieve goals of ensuring public safety, transparency, and accountability, we can't allow that sort of access to denial to be part of the landscape in Ontario. Complainants need expeditious access to all relevant footage. The second point that I'll make that we also made in the TPS consultation, which is also reflected in the Toronto Police policy, is the need for criteria for when officers must record and requirements on officers to provide concrete, contemporaneous, on-camera justifications for failing to record required events. And this is sort of picking up on Professor Saulnier's point earlier. Officers should begin recording at the earliest opportunity, prior to any contact with a member of the public, whenever that contact is for an investigative or enforcement purpose, and regardless of whether or not the person is within camera view, unless there's an exception that applies. Now, if we look to other North American cities, we've seen a host of problems associated with problematic recording practices. In Philadelphia, for example, a 2019 report based on in-depth investigations of 60 body camera videos showed that there were only 6 instances where officers turned on the cameras prior to placing arrestees in handcuffs. In other words, all of the actions that occurred to handcuffing were not captured in the vast majority of incidents. And that problem is reflected in the brevity of most of the videos. 33 of these 60 videos were less than 3 minutes, and many were near 1 minute or less than 1 minute. So for these reasons, clear criteria for when officers must record is absolutely essential, and that has to be coupled with meaningful disciplinary consequences for noncompliance.
Thank you, Raj. And if you had a difficult time, Colin, you're going to have an even tougher time because you're last on the panel. Colin Fries, what are your top two elements for a governance framework?
Well, you've given me a note here because as a journalist, I don't know if it's my job to influence policy or shape it. And what can I say that hasn't been said already? I mean, but speaking in terms of principles, I think, broadly in other contexts at other times, I think, clarity is better than lack of clarity. To the extent that these rules are set down and police forces are going to abide by them, that would be good to know. It would be nice, for example, as more and more forces adopt this from Nunavut to Calgary to Toronto, are these, if they set them down, will we be able to see where there's discrepancies among police forces? In general, one of the things I think we as journalists have problems seeing into is enforceability of this stuff, to the extent that a police officer may want to, remove his name tag at a G20 protest. What are the consequences of that? So push that forward into coming years. To the extent that an officer switches off his or her body camera at an inopportune moment, what is that? Are somebody going to be docked a day's pay, given a talking to, or will there be more serious consequences? And will these consequences be known about? Third, and I think this is an idea I got from Chris Parsons way back when, in another era and another time, when in 1970s, when we were debating wiretap laws, governments had this notion that they would have something like a transparency report. They would report to the Solicitors General. How many times have we used an invasive technology? How many times has it broken down? So at least a minister or an overarching body would be informed, and at least somebody could keep score, both the use of invasive technologies or on the aggregate cases where people fell down and didn't use these technologies correctly. So those are principles I'm talking about. It's not hard and fast policy guidance, but there are, I think, some lessons in the past.
Excellent. So definite emphasis on accountability and transparency from your perspective. I'd like to turn to Alana again. As privacy regulators, we're often asked the tough question whether we support the use of a new technology. And our response, as you can imagine, typically depends on a number of things, including whether the technology will be able to deliver on its intended promises. Because, let's face it, if it isn't, what's the point of compromising people's privacy? The challenge we have is that evidence about the effectiveness of the technology is not always available when it's first deployed, or even if it is, it might still change over time. So what processes and mechanisms do you think need to be in place to continually assess the effectiveness of a technology like body-worn cameras and to stop its use when it's no longer working as it should?
So I think we're very fortunate to already have an excellent baseline mechanism in that regard in the form of police services boards. All municipal police services across Ontario have police services boards that oversee how policing is provided in their local community and that are composed of local community members. Police services boards are external to the police service, and these boards serve a variety of specific functions, one of which is to determine objectives and priorities for police services. And boards have real authority in that regard, in that they also approve budgets, operating budgets, which includes technology acquisitions and continuations. I think that a primary way that we can keep police use of surveillance technologies streamlined is to empower those police service boards to be as knowledgeable as possible. And that can be accomplished by regularly integrating researchers, both internal to and external to police services, into police service board meetings to share existing research. So, for example, summarizing the scope of known information on a particular topic, as well as partnering to conduct research. And that research should absolutely include process and outcome evaluations of technologies, surveys of public satisfaction and concerns with technologies, and surveys of service members, both civilian and sworn, to draw on practitioner knowledge banks to identify effectiveness lapses. Collectively, those sources of information provide the knowledge to persons in positions of decision-making authority, these police service board members, to make informed decisions about police use of surveillance technologies. And I don't mean to suggest that these strategies need to all be simultaneously, continually occurring for every technology that police use. But what I think would be very valuable is a tiered system that involves police service boards being well informed on trends in existing research, being well informed on local public and police concerns, and being well informed on the findings of process and outcome evaluations of surveillance technologies used by their service.
Excellent, thank you. So I'd like to move away from body-worn cameras now and zoom out, no pun intended, to discuss the other surveillance technologies used or being considered for use by law enforcement, the kinds that Chris gave us an overview about at the very beginning. So let me turn back to you, Chris, as someone who studies these technologies day in, day out at the Citizen Lab, where you work. Which two, frankly, frighten you the most, and why?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like a bag of badness, and which one do I pick out of? So I think that there's two, but there's a broader point, and I'll leave that to the end. So the first is malware. And we see this quite often deployed, increasingly in national security cases, but it's moving into the policing environment. And it's worrying for two reasons. One, I don't think we've had a public debate in this country in a meaningful way. I remember at a parliamentary committee a few years ago, I notified some colleagues of mine from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association say, hey, you should be aware of this. There's a little clause in this legislation that might offer malware in a very delimited case. And they were shocked, having studied the legislation. And then when they mentioned it to the members of parliament in the committee, they were all blown away, like they couldn't believe it was there. That then got passed into law. But I know from speaking with people at justice and in law enforcement communities across Ontario and the country, that we see this technology used. It's becoming cheaper, it's becoming easier to use. And not only is it more pervasive, having not had a discussion, but many of the actors who produce and provide this are bad actors. So they're producing it for law enforcement, and they're also selling it to law enforcement in repressive regimes that use the same technologies to target human rights defenders, journalists, both within their jurisdiction and beyond their jurisdiction. So I think that there's a real question as to whether these are companies we should be in bed with in the first place, if this is the technology that we should be using. More broadly, I'm concerned about a lot of the discussions about the technologies to address the so-called going dark problem. I use so-called deliberately. Recent research has demonstrated that on a mobile device, even if you're using an iPhone, it is not nearly as well secured as people imagine, which is why there's all sorts of tools and devices to get into it. But we don't have real transparency into the way that law enforcement is using tools as they exist now, which means we're in a very confused debate and discussion. So I think it's not so much I'm worried about those devices, but I'm worried about the language of the debate around it. And are we talking about tools that we need to break transmission encryption? So what we all have right now over a Zoom call that keeps us safe from people sending malware to us over the call? Are we worried about security of our devices? Are we worried about the security of data on the server? And there's a number of technologies that are used to get around that. And again, I think it's because we have a fundamental problem in how we're discussing what's going on. But my grab bag is filled with a lot of, I'm sort of worried, but I don't know quite what the tool is, right? And that's again because we have this instinct of reflexive secrecy. If law enforcement discloses the tools they're using, therefore bad guys will be able to evade us. Yep, that's possible. But that's sort of why we live in a democracy. We know that intercepts are possible, they're still conducted. We know production orders can happen, they still work. And so I think that the fact that the IPC had spent a lot of time fighting over IMSI catchers in this province. It happened at the federal level as well. Are they used? Are they not used? That was a 10-year discussion when everyone in the know knew what was going on. We shouldn't be in a situation where technologies are used pervasively and on an ongoing basis without public accountability. So it's the secrecy that masks the new tools, which I think is the biggest problem of all.
Great point. And speaking of MC catchers, I'd like to turn to Colin Fries. I know you've been covering stories about the police use of technologies like MC catchers and other surveillance issues for quite a long time now. So let me ask you, what surprises you the most about police use of surveillance technology? And given what you know, are there some key lessons or takeaways that the public should know about?
Yeah, I mean, what surprises me is often how often I'm surprised. I mean, there is, this discussion around body-worn cameras is a bit of a novelty to me personally. It seems there's a lot of sort of interchange between bodies like your own and police services to try to sort of put everybody's best foot forward from the get-go. There's another way this kind of happens, which is that, maybe police are having a conference for a certain kind of detective, and somebody shows up with a booth for a special kind of facial recognition software and starts passing out copies to rank and file officers who may not even tell their chiefs that they're going to use this. The MC catchers report, and Chris Parsons and Citizen Labs in particular did a great job of publicly highlighting this a few years ago. I mean, they wrote a humdinger of a report, him and Tamir Israel, I think, sort of talking about the potential uses as police were saying zip. And in freedom of information requests were coming back blank. In spoken comments, I think some police spokesperson said this is not happening, when in fact it was happening. Even in the MC catcher case, there was a case where this technology had very clearly been used in a prosecution against alleged members of the Montreal Mafia in a murder case. Now, those guys, this was a prosecution occurring in open court, but once the murder charge, but once that was sort of, the technology got to be discussed, the Crown just walked away from that, an appeal of the use of that technology and the secrecy around it, rather than fight that out in the courts. So how did it get to that point, and how can you be confident that you can take a prosecution to that degree without having public disclosures around it? I think we all understand that there is a technological cat and mouse game being played out, that police are, as Chris says, feel they're going dark, and that they need tools to equalize the sort of playing field. And all that's fair enough, but I think it is that, at the end of the day, law enforcement is about producing adducible evidence in court in front of people's eyes and ears. So, how can we, as that appellate court case I point out, police don't have a legal protection for secret techniques or devices. So, so I've been surprised. I think sometimes police and prosecutors think they do, they don't. So anyway, I'm surprised at how often I'm surprised, basically.
Okay, thank you. Colin Stairs, we'd like to hear from you from the perspective of the police. With so many new technologies coming to market, and as the key potential user of these, what challenges or maybe opportunities do you anticipate with their adoption, and how do you address the need for both protecting rights and delivering on public safety?
So I think this whole conversation leads to this perception that the police are chomping at the bit to use all sorts of surveillance technologies and these advanced methods, which is actually not the case. There's a significant reluctance to use some of these technologies because of the approbation of bodies, the public in general, etc. So I think one of the big challenges we have is the white space between what is potential, and Chris outlined that very well, and all the threats and dangers of those potentials, and what is practice. And I think in practice, Colin Fries identified sort of, that someone's handing out software to frontline officers and they're just starting to use this stuff. That's a real threat and a danger. And so the maturity of the police organizations in managing and governing these technologies has to improve. That's in part why the Toronto Police brought me on board, because I'm only new as of 9 months ago. So that maturity needs to advance, but really we also need to have more public conversations about where the line is. And that's twofold. It's actually a benefit to police to think about where that line is so that we can advance to it, because I think we're being very conservative in some of the use of technologies as organizations, and also to reassure the public of what we're not doing, which there's a lot of froth about surveillance technologies in media and the public and sci-fi. You'd almost think we're in some sort of cyberpunk dystopia, and we're not. So my entry into the service and getting to see all this stuff, I'm actually surprised at how little we use, and how modest advancements could serve the public good and not be a threat to public privacy. So I think the conversations that we're having, we should have more of these conversations, which are laying out for the public what the debate is, what the issues are, what the conversation should be, and where those trade-offs need to be made. And I would also say that this advancing surveillance technology is not the main thrust of the police right now. What we're trying to do is be more community-oriented, and trying to use technologies to reach out and engage, to divert people from negative outcomes in their lives, and to be able to create linkages to the public health system, mental health system, substance abuse, etc.
Thank you, Colin. And your comments certainly demonstrate the incredible importance of the kind of leadership you're providing and the role that you're playing with the Toronto Police Service. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Next question. No matter how effective a technology is, it will never truly be successful unless the public is behind it, feels protected, and trusts its use. Raj, let me ask you, as someone who's had your finger regularly on the pulse of many Ontarians who care about these kinds of issues, what do you think it'll take for the public to trust police use of body-worn cameras and other surveillance technologies in a more general sense?
Let me respond to that by maybe just starting with maybe a counterpoint to the point that I think Professor Saulnier made earlier about empirical findings of widespread public support for the use of body-worn cameras. In our experience, in our engagements to date with communities, that very much seems to depend on who you're engaging with. And what we are finding is that as the public debate continues around the use of surveillance technologies, and in particular, in this case, body-worn cameras, we are finding that there is there's a lot more diversity of thought and opinion around this issue. So for example, in July 2020, when the Peel Police Services Board was contemplating the introduction of body-worn cameras in Peel, the board received almost 200 deputations, all of which were against body-worn cameras. And in the words of one of the board members who was quoted, every one of the deputations we have received, 100% of those deputations is opposed to having body-worn cameras, and I don't understand that. So the opposition in these deputations centered on concerns about cameras being expensive, being selectively and opportunistically turned off by officers, being incapable of producing true reform, and so forth. So some of the things that we've been discussing through the course of today in this panel. In November 2017, when the OHRC, when we launched our public interest inquiry into racial profiling and racial discrimination by the Toronto Police Service, we invoked an expression. It was truth before trust. And as it applies to this topic, it's quite understandable that the public may not trust police use of technologies until the full truth of how they will be used is articulated and demonstrated. And I think in particular, and just to pick up on some of the earlier comments by Chris and Professor Saulnier, we really need to consider the evolving research on the efficacy of body-worn cameras and how this ostensibly race-neutral technology can have negative race-specific consequences. For example, Professor Saulnier has already spoken to findings in some of the research that we've seen that reveal that body-worn camera footage has been proven useful in supporting prosecutions. But if the aim is to foster trust, will we get that trust if these technologies are being used to further criminalize communities? There's a September 2020 California Law Review article which notes there are widespread issues with body-worn cameras being deployed for discriminatory purposes in certain neighborhoods or against certain defendants. Prosecutors have a long history of hiding or refusing to turn over exculpatory evidence, and there is no formal requirement forcing law enforcement to turn over footage during the plea bargaining process prior to a criminal trial. So with this in mind, with these kind of concerns in mind, one means of fostering trust would be to demonstrate, particularly to racialized communities, that footage may be used for exculpatory purposes rather than for the exclusive purpose of generating more convictions in a system that already produces significant disparities year after year. Like criminalization is already widespread in Ontario. In the last year, based on the statistics I've seen, 190,000 people were charged with criminal code offenses. That's about 16,000 people per month. So will surveillance technologies increase those numbers? And if so, what segments of the population will bear the burden of that greater criminalization? I mean, those are the kind of truthful answers that we need to be able to provide before we can talk about trust. And just the final point I'll make on this is that when we're trying to get buy-in from communities on the benefits of technology and the use of this kind of technology, we have to consider the trade-offs. For example, in the current debate with respect to body-worn cameras, in choosing to allocate funding to this initiative, we're not dedicating resources to supports within communities and other prevention-focused initiatives. And I think, when we've heard from communities about their concerns around this, that's very much often a focus of those concerns. I think it was Chris that suggested earlier, we need to engage communities, we need to hear what they're telling us, and we need to make sure that we're being responsive to their concerns.
Okay, thank you. And because public trust affects all of us, I'd like to ask that same question to some of the other panelists who may have views on this. Let me start with Colin Fries. You as a reporter working for the media, you're very much, as you said, the interlocutor for the public on some of these issues. So, what are your views on what we need to secure public trust?
Well, I think, in giving due deferences to Colin Stairs' position, yeah, I don't think we want to fuel narratives about, lawlessness and gravitation towards dystopian technologies. I think the media has a right to report these things responsibly, factually, and sort of hew to the realities of police work as it is practiced today. In terms of sort of fostering trust, I think, police are agents of the public, privacy commissioners are too. I mean, I think it's just there are no delineations between people who can discuss technologies and people who can't. So doing what we're doing here today, which is bringing together a broad sector of people involved with universities, privacy commissioners, academics, police information, let's have these conversations. Let's all just, not go off in all our different directions, and let's actually sort of try to bring a sort of central discussion in a way that sort of hews to the reality of events and, highlights the frictions and also highlights, in some cases, the necessity for technologies in police work. I mean, there is a rising tempo of technologies that'll just be coming down the pipes in coming years, and we're not going to be able to have a detailed discussion about each one. So having frameworks and understandings and the ability to communicate, I think, will go a long way to fostering public trust.
Excellent. Thank you. Any parting comments on public trust before we go to the audience questions?
Complementing both Raj and Colin's comments, I would say that technologies need to speak to the public's understanding of what is fair, which we know includes, feeling respected, feeling heard, and that the technology and, coming back to Chris's statements, in its design, its application, in its outcomes, are that it's unbiased. Through an uncritical lens, technology can really flaunt these appeals, but it can also very much mask issues in those regards. So establishing when and why technologies are perceived as fair by the public, I think is really a really critical area of research that we should be focusing on.
Excellent point. Any other comment?
I'll jump in if I may.
Yeah, Stephen.
I just want to pick up on some of the really potent remarks of my fellow panelists and emphasize that we really do need to see, police and the public need to see the dividends paid by the work being done, for example, in the area of body-worn cameras. The chair of the Toronto Police Services Board said at the board meeting announcing the finalization of its policy on body-worn cameras that the process to get to that policy and the companion procedure was something of a first of its kind in the country. It was a very transparent process with a police procedure made available in draft form, and quite an unusual move and quite an engagement. And that kind of transparency is going to help with dividends. I think to Raj's point, there needs to be transparency about how body-worn camera footage is used. Of course, it has to be used to both convict and acquit, to train, discipline, and recognize good police work. And it can't just happen behind closed doors. The public has to know what's happening in that regard in order for public safety to be delivered effectively and public trust in good policing bear out. And then one last comment. I think it's important to know that, our work is never done. Back in, I think it was around 2005, the IPC went to the Toronto Police Services Board over the right of expungement to records in mugshot databases, fingerprints and mugshots. And the board put forward a procedure that highlighted people's right to seek expungement on non-conviction dispositions, and more transparency about those rules and procedures is vital for people to know those rights, is to be able to exercise those rights, and that's just, without that knowledge, there's not going to be trust.
Excellent point. Thank you. I'd like to, first of all, I want to thank the panelists for an extraordinary discussion, but don't go away. We have more questions coming in from our audience, and I'd like to start in on some of those because we have quite a list. There's a couple of questions I can probably address right off the bat. The first is whether the IPC has plans to develop guidance specific to law enforcement and surveillance technologies. So I can answer by saying yes, we are intending on drawing from our experience of working with the Toronto Police Service and its board to issue a generic governance framework that around the use of body-worn cameras in particular that can be used by other police services across the province. Another question, again, targeted at or addressed to the IPC is whether enforcement of privacy law for law enforcement is on our agenda. And there again, I'd like to say that yes, it is on our agenda. We're currently consulting on what should be our strategic priorities for the next 5 years. We received public and stakeholder submissions. We're going through them now. And one of the potential priorities we identified is on the shortlist is law enforcement and next generation surveillance technologies. So please stay tuned, and we will be announcing our strategic priorities very soon. The next question I think would be a good one for Raj. If you can tell us, are the benefits of surveillance technologies used by police outweighed by the potential harms resulting from social inequities? Now, I know we've talked a lot about that throughout the panel, but are there any additional points you'd like to make to address that specific question from the audience?
Well, when we speak about benefits, or maybe a better way of putting it is potential benefits relative to potential harms, this does come down to, I think, in part, a question of power, as I think we spoke about earlier in the panel. Who stands to benefit? And, we've already talked about the research that has demonstrated that prosecutors can benefit insofar as certain body-worn camera footage is being used extensively in some jurisdictions for these prosecutions. But if this is how the footage is being used, and if we are talking about power, then existing power imbalances between police and prosecutors on the one hand, and defendants and lawyers on the other hand, will only intensify. And the defendants with the least resources are very likely to be Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities. So if that turns out to be the case, who benefits? I think it's also worth considering just around these questions about potential benefit, the question of body-worn cameras in relation to deadly force. And in that regard, in the US, the Washington Post has been tracking fatal police shootings since 2015. And in that time, there have been more than 5,000 such shootings that have been recorded by the Washington Post. About 1,000 a year. And why is that notable? Because over the same period of time, from 2015 to now, body-worn cameras have become more prevalent, yet fatal shootings remain remarkably stable at about 1,000 shootings per year. So reducing fatal police shootings doesn't seem to be one of the benefits of body-worn cameras. Even though those shootings, those kinds of events are a major concern of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities. What about other surveillance technologies and their apparent benefits? Like, I'm thinking in this regard about CCTV cameras. The Toronto Police Service states that they locate CCTV cameras where they have the biggest impact on protecting public safety, and those decisions are only made after exhaustive research. That's what their website says. But what are the benefits? Let's consider CCTV in relation to a crime that takes place in the public, like a robbery. If we look at the data over the past few years, we find that on a typical day in Toronto, we have about 10 reported robberies, and on a typical day, 4 people are charged with robbery. Now, where is the evidence that CCTV cameras have either reduced the number of robberies and or increased the ability of police to correctly identify and charge those who commit robbery? The data that we've reviewed to date doesn't seem to demonstrate either benefit, even though CCTV cameras have presumably become more common in the city, and they are often touted as having meaningful deterrent value. So beyond these specific questions about potential benefit, the OHRC's position is that you can have every officer in the province outfitted with body-worn cameras, but that won't amount to much in the face of systemic and structural discrimination. If body-worn cameras are viewed as a means to the end of fostering greater accountability and trust with communities, they may have some limited value, but they should not be regarded as a panacea to systemic discrimination, and they should not be put in place in the absence of a more holistic approach to addressing systemic discrimination.
Thank you. I want to turn to another question we got from a registrant for the panel today on the use of genetic genealogy by law enforcement. And I'd like to hear Colin Freeze on that, because I know you've published an article about, or two, a couple of articles about this in recent months. So what are your views on this new use of genetic genealogy to solve cold murder cases, among others?
Oh, I just think that's a technology that bears watching, and I think your office and the Federal Privacy Commissioner have sort of been highlighting for a time now the use of consumer DNA sites. The idea that you can give a saliva sample, send it down to the United States, have it analyzed, find out your family tree. And I think now through roundabout ways that that's kind of making slowly a picture of the entire human genome, people's family trees through time. And there are ways to access that for police investigation purposes. Now, to the good, the Toronto Police sort of, broke the seal on that technology, or at least they announced they were the first to claim the use of that technology in solving the very horrible Christine Jessup murder case that went unsolved for nearly 40 years, led to a horrendous wrongful conviction. So, the closure on that case, I think, was something that, rightly got a lot of people excited. But what we're, sometimes I think there wasn't a lot of public discourse about this technology. And now I think going back at it, you see that the Jessup case wasn't the first use of this. We will see, possibly in coming months, trials where, in other jurisdictions where people live. Now, the Jessup case, that involved a killer who's deceased. So that's kind of easy for for police to talk about that. I think in coming months, we will see trials where people have been, charged with through the same or similar methods, where a sort of relative who did a consumer DNA test gave examples of a genome that trickled down through a series of U.S. companies that police were able to access that before determining who the suspect was. So I just think it bears watching. It is a technology not contemplated by legislation. The access points are multi-jurisdictional, international, in the cloud. So everything, and there hasn't been a lot of writing about this in terms of Canadian use of this technology. So I think it's and we all have a stake in, and so will we use this for murder cases, for sexual assault cases? I think those are the current guidelines, but once that sort of is all mapped out, what other possible uses will there be? So I think that's a technology that bears watching.
Yes, I agree as well. I think it's a very, very interesting and important one, particularly as it raises the privacy rights and interests of not the person who subscribed to the genealogy website, but to their family members who did not and are brought under greater scrutiny as a result of their genetic affiliation. Fascinating question. Next question I'd like to turn to, and this one is for Stephen because it's about IPC's role. What authority does the IPC have to regulate uses of personal information gathered by police through surveillance? And does the IPC require new powers, or are its existing ones sufficient? I think this was intended to be ex ante uses of personal information gathered by police by surveillance technologies. So if you can address that particular aspect.
Thank you, Commissioner. Let me start with the second question. For many years, the IPC has been recommending that Ontario's public sector privacy legislation be modernized, including by providing the IPC with additional powers to order police and other government actors to make changes to the way they use and disclose personal information. At present, we have limited order-making powers in the privacy context. We can only order government to cease collecting personal information and destroy collections of personal information after we determine that the collection contravenes one of those two public sector privacy statutes. And we've issued such orders in a couple of cases, ex ante responses to practices that contravene the Act. For example, in a case dealing with police surveillance of used goods, sales, and also the conduct of excessive background checks on prospective jurors. In the meantime, however, we continue to make effective use of our powers to research, investigate, report on, recommend, and consult with government and police and others on a wide range of privacy issues. And we have used those soft powers to good effect with collaborating provincial and municipal institutions, including police in Toronto and across the province. Consider not only our work with the Toronto Police and the board on body-worn camera governance, but our work with, for example, the OPP to shape police use of automatic license plate recognition tools. We have guidance out on that flew from that kind of engagement. and consider another example, the work with the TPS and other police to limit the disclosure of mental health information to the National Police Database, CPIC. More time, I'd provide more examples, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And this speaks to the fact that there is no legal statutory requirement to submit privacy impact assessments to the office, but to the credit of many public institutions, particularly when there are high-risk programs, they do so and engage with our office. And I think through that engagement and that constructive dialogue, we get to a much better place advising on those privacy impact assessments. I see time going. I'm going to try, if we can, limit the next answers to a quick minute. The next one is to Chris Parsons. I'd like to ask you this audience question. What can you tell us about the police, how the police currently are using location data from mobile phones to track and find suspects? And what's the best way to prevent function creep when it comes to this kind of surveillance technology?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. There are a large volume of ways that can be done. So I want to be clear that's not all done by any given police force. This is a large spectrum. One is there's I think of it as mostly an underground data brokerage network, but I'm sure the people in that market would say it's very above board, even if you can't figure out who they are. But your applications on your phones are constantly leaking information. So one, there's a prominent example of a prayer app that was used to identify when to pray. It was used by Muslims around the world. And it turns out that has been disclosed with law enforcement and military bodies around the world. So apps, one way. There's also tower dumps and geolocation information that's available from cell carriers. That's done in Canada right now. And after a series of decisions and tests around tower dumps, I think that there are better rules around it. More locally, there's IMSI catchers can be used not just to identify the mobile identifiers, but to confirm that a certain phone is in a location and the strength, so you can figure out where someone is. In some cases, we're seeing malware being used, which is concerning as a way of tracking. We're seeing, especially in the United States, more and more law enforcement agencies going to Google and other map manufacturers and saying, hey, who was at this location at what time? And then in the case of Google, also following up with search warrants, and not just search warrants for data, but actual search records of what you typed into Google to figure out, oh, well, isn't it suspicious that your car says or your phone says you're somewhere and you were searching how to drive somewhere? So those are a handful of the methods. In addition to that, one of the emerging areas which I think is underappreciated is the insecurity of motor vehicles. So when you pair your smartphone to them, I suspect not many people are aware that the data that is imprinted from your phone into the vehicle is kept, in many cases, indefinitely. And if you're using a rental car these days, most rental agencies are outsourcing, or many of them are outsourcing to a private contractor that upon request to police can then pull all of that data very quickly and very easily. So how do we prevent function creep? Really, the first thing is figure out what you actually need the data for and nothing more beyond it, so you can't creep beyond the data you have. Then have very clear regulations to how data can be used and when, and require very prominent public consultation before new technologies are adopted. We're moving at a pace so quickly that novel insights are perceived that are seen as useful by law enforcement and other government agencies. But part of the problem is a lot of the tools aren't made for law enforcement proper. So they're drawing correlations. They're like, oh, well, A and B suggest this, and this is useful for law enforcement investigations. But the problem is correlations are often insufficient to actually advance an investigation. And so I think we need to have purpose-built tools, accountability, and delimited data sets.
Thank you. I can't resist the temptation to give the last word to Colin Stairs with a two-part question. Colin, how do changes in technology impact the duties, responsibilities, and expectations of police officers? And what kind of evolution, what kind of change in policing culture also needs to happen in order to go hand in hand with this evolution in technology?
So my answer is changing as I'm listening to everyone, because I have to take an account of all the great debate and commentary. And I think many of the points have been addressed. If we're thinking about how police need to change, one, we have to become much more sophisticated around our use of technology, our understanding of it, and our intersection with privacy and law. Police are interested in solving crimes and keeping the public safe, and that's our primary mission. But we have to understand how complicated that mission gets when we start getting into technology. So cyber is creeping into all sorts of different divisions and different functions, and there needs to be a conversation about how that works. But I would equally say that there's an ongoing and very powerful conversation about police reform and the focus on police reform and how that needs to manifest in technology. So the conversation we're not having about technology is how technology can serve to bring communities closer to their policing services and vice versa. And that's one of the areas that I'd personally like to focus on is, okay, how are we facilitating a conversation? And how are we getting away from crime prosecution into diversion and into supporting communities? So if we're thinking about, okay, I'm having an interaction with a member of the public, am I there to serve or am I there to protect? And that balance is something that is an ongoing conversation. So as we talk about defund the police, detask the police, all those conversations, I'd really like to see us using technology to link the police to the other public services that will allow the detasking, but will allow it to happen in a seamless way. And I think these surveillance technologies, these advances in the sort of the hard edge of policing are all there, and they all need to have conversations, controls, and we as the police don't necessarily have the trust to have that conversation directly with the public. So agencies like the IPC, like the Ontario Human Rights Commission, need to be part of that conversation as representatives of those stakeholders and those voices in order that we can have a conversation that's trusted. So if we can have those conversations, I think we can build trust overall, and then we can turn our attention to the effort that I think it needs to be where we're talking about police reform and we're talking about service to the community and how we do that.
Wow, what an excellent way to round out the discussion. Thank you so much, Colin. And thank you to all of our guest panelists for this extraordinary event that helped mark Privacy Day. I had the easy job of moderating such a distinguished panel, and I've passed on the much harder challenge and the much tougher job to my colleague, Ron Krzyzewski from Saskatchewan, to wrap up with a few observations or key takeaways. And I'd like to turn the mic over to Ron and then to Assistant Commissioner Sherry Liang to wrap up the day and put an end to our excellent Privacy Day, my first, and hopefully with many more to come. So thank you all, and over to you, Ron.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thanks for inviting me. And I think you tasked me with coming up with some takeaways. I'm awestruck by 1,000 people signing in for this particular webinar, and we all come at it from different perspectives. So I will probably end up with each of us having a slightly different takeaway. But before I tackle a few of those, first I had to sort of wrestle with the reality that I think we all accept, that pretty well all of us walk around with smartphones, and oh yes, they have cameras and microphones. And they're used everywhere to capture events, and events that people might think are private. With a couple of clicks, they are up on the internet and they're public. In addition, people can download a facial recognition app and start to look at those videos and possibly determine who exactly was in that particular event. So that's kind of a reality we live in, and you know, we're all faced with that every day in our private lives. We're now talking about what a public institution does, like a police force. another takeaway for me is I've been commissioner for 6.5 years. And I think the conversation over body cams in 2014 would have been quite different than the conversation I heard today. And I think what I heard today, body cams are a tool. We have to approach that tool with a sense of balance. We have to ferret out the benefits of the tool, and we have to focus on the dangers. And I'm hearing significant praise for the governance framework that's being worked out with Toronto Police. And the hub of it is when you have a tool, it's all going to be what's in the policies and procedures. And I was also hearing complementary things there. Thirdly, I think a takeaway for all of us, the 1,000 of us that are on this call, is yes, a police force has to make a decision, use body cams or not, develop the policy and procedure. But this is, in our democracy, a decision for our society. And what I heard here is a lot of conversation in the decisions that the Toronto Police Force is coming to. And I think from what I hear and the degree of consensus around the panel is a very good template has been developed, and certainly one that others across Canada could certainly use. The other takeaway, and I guess we all know this, body cams are not the only tool. There's a whole bunch of other tools, and panelists have flagged a good number of them. They're either here or they're coming, and the templates developed here in terms of a conversation to manage those tools, getting a governance framework, getting policy and procedures. I think obviously that template would apply in Ontario and could and should apply across the country. And finally, the takeaway is as these tools come along, there's a real need to increase the trust in our institutions in a democracy. And as we make decisions, society and police forces, we have to keep our eye on the ball. We need to build trust in all of those government institutions that are so important to our democracy. So that's my takeaways for the day, Patricia. Thanks for inviting me. It's been a great morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. And I'm going to be really, really brief with just some thank yous. Before people start dropping off, before our audience starts dropping off, I'll let you know quickly that the website, the webcast will stay up for anyone who wasn't able to watch it today or would like to see it again. We're also going to post it to our YouTube page. So feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And what a fantastic morning we've had. Raj, Colin Stairs, Colin Fries, Chris, Alana, Stephen, you've given us so much to think about, and my head is just buzzing with everything that we've covered today. And, you know, as with many issues around the adoption of technology, whether it's by police, healthcare providers, government service agencies, schools, we know, and this was reinforced by the discussion today, that a critical part of that picture is about trust, and that's what Ron was talking about as well. We can all benefit when technology is used for the common good, to help us connect, to keep us safe, but how can we trust that it is being used for the common good? And I think we've heard a lot of great things today about the building blocks of that trust relationship between technology-enabled policing and the community. It was a really, really great conversation, and I just want to thank you all on behalf of the IPC and everyone listening for your time, for your great thoughts, and for being able to communicate your deep reflections with us in a really accessible way. And of course, I'll thank the audience too for being part of this conversation and also contributing some great questions that kept us on our toes. So have a great day, everyone. Keep safe, take care of yourselves and your loved ones. Bye, everyone.